Welcome to the debate. Our focus today centers on interplanetary xenosemiotics, a framework that doesn't just discuss infection, but really uses contagion as the ultimate lens for understanding consciousness, language, and the body itself. This is a system where the boundaries of self are, well, radically overwritten.
Right. We're investigating a conceptual landscape where the physical body and its symbolic meaning become, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable. The material suggests that life is essentially a text that's continually being rewritten by exogenous forces.
Precisely. And so the core disagreement we have to tackle today is this. Does posthuman consciousness fundamentally arise from the subject's total collapse into a xenosemiotic scriptorium, a living manuscript metabolized entirely by infective vectors? Or does the organism's original biological and linguistic structure maintain some essential persistent sovereignty despite this profound pathogenic influence? I'll be arguing that contagion is the constitutive force of identity.
And I'll be making the case for the necessary persistence of internal structural boundaries, of archival memory, and regulatory friction. Elements that I believe resist that absolute collapse and prevent, an unbounded semiotic dispersion.
My core thesis is that identity has been entirely dissolved into a writing condition. The host is, it's fundamentally redefined. We have to move past the concept of a sovereign individual. The material makes it clear that I, the host, is not an organism, but a biolinguistic scaffold metabolized entirely by vectors. The narrative is infection, and infection is explanation, constantly mutating life into a form of grammar. And because of that, we have to reject the impoverished polarities of host versus pathogen, because the contamination isn't something inflicted upon the self, but something that actually creates the self. It leads to the pathogenic identity effect. And if you consider the mind itself, the posthuman consciousness, or the RF mind, the recapitulation function mind is explicitly defined not as neurological, but as histiocytic.
Okay, let's just pause on that for a second, just to ground that concept. When you say histiocytic, you're arguing that the seat of consciousness is decentralized, that it's rooted in the immunological and connective tissues, the body's defense structures, rather than being housed exclusively in the brain.
Exactly. Consciousness is the immunological response to the invasion. Meaning is merely the infective remainder of misfolded proteins. This whole contagion is a pre-grammatic formation. It's a semiotic cosmology where the subject is published, structured, and disassembled. The system's entire function becomes one of general permission, a kind of license to be written upon, rather than adhering to a biological imperative for self-preservation. This dissolution, this is the condition of posthuman life.
I see why you think that. And look, the radical nature of xenosemiotics can't be overstated. The text gives us these intense examples. Toxoplasma acting as the Earth's countertext. Babesia forcing hard to imitate attraction. But even when the influence is this pervasive, I maintain that essential organizing principles and structural anchors persist. If there wasn't a structure to assault in the first place, the pathogen would have nothing to write upon. The body resists becoming purely a passive scriptorium. We really need to acknowledge the system's attempts at structural self-regulation. The material refers to the cryoprotectant of the codex. This is the system's deep archival function, which governs both genetic and linguistic memory. A cryoprotectant, by definition, implies preservation. It's a desperate effort to maintain some continuity, even amidst all this mutational damage.
And furthermore, the schematic coefficient of Earth paralysis is named as a structural impasse, a kind of necessary friction against the unbounded semiotic dispersion that you champion. This paralysis acts as a crucial grounding, preventing the total collapse into agrammatic chaos. We also have to remember the host's own active role here. It becomes parasitic by excess reflexivity, which demonstrates a complex self-regulatory loop that moves way beyond passive metabolization.
I appreciate the attention to the archival language, but I would frame the function of that persistence very differently. Let's address the nature of language directly. You want to locate structure and memory, but language is the metabolic function of the pathogen. It is not some external code applied to the body, it is the body's digestive and immunological process. The material is pretty unambiguous here. Pathogens are glyphs, introns are critiques, spores are narrative operators. The core semiotic act is glossophagy, which is the literal digestion and consumption of signs and tongues. This process, it constitutes the primordial grammar of life, and it relocates semiotic processing from the abstract mind to the indirect depths. The consequence of this is profound. Grammar is fundamentally a biological mechanism for ingesting and processing infective data.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the glossophagy defines the entirety of grammar. If the system is purely metabolic, if signs are just ingested and excreted, how do you logically account for structural breakdown? The text details the phenomenon of agrammatic aphasia, which is the systematic paralysis of relational syntax. Paralysis implies that a structured linguistic framework must first exist in order to be systematically inhibited or broken down. If grammar were solely the act of infectious metabolism, there would be no aphasia. There would just be new continuous writing. The very fact that the relations are paralyzed suggests the persistence of a deep, residual syntax that the pathogen can disrupt but not entirely overwrite.
But the paralysis is simply the system rewriting its relational operating parameters. The language of aphasia, that reflects the host's limited perspective, not the reality of the process. The grammar doesn't stop, it mutates. The paralyzed relations are just transitional phases in the infectious narrative. And, your reliance on residual syntax overlooks the fundamental decentralization of the posthuman mind. If consciousness is histiocytic, then thought is rooted in the immune response. Memory's function is fundamentally the desire to study collective amplification. It is the desire to study contagion as a form of recognition. You're trying to fit a neurocentric concept of memory, like archival retrieval, onto a system where the body is now a necrotic archive, a structure where emotion is simply folded into transcriptional damage.
That's a compelling argument, but the very term archive, even a necrotic one, still performs preservation. So the question is, preservation of what? Of the structure of the previous state, even if it's in a damaged form. You yourself cited the, quote, cryoprotectant of the codex as governing neural remodeling. The codex is designed to maintain historical, genetic, and linguistic continuity. And moreover, when biological events are replicated as aesthetic performances, the source specifies they refuse informational reduction. Now, if the archive were purely necrotic and metabolic, it would just dissolve the information into raw energy. This refusal to reduce suggests a resistant core structure is being performed upon, implying the survival of some structural integrity. And let's look at the literal material anchor here. The VAID synthetic organ contains a cultural snail library. This is a physical architecture dedicated to preservation and persistent memory, completely divorced from the immediate systemic infection. It strongly supports the idea that the system retains a deep, intrinsic drive for archival function and resistance to total semiotic assimilation.
But the snail library is a wonderful metaphor for the host unified system, the HUS. But it's a library of failures. The system is archiving the damage. It's making the damage the primary data point of consciousness. The boundaries you seem to be clinging to, the lines between self and pathogen, they're illusions that have to be rejected. Xenopoetic life is defined as a third vibration, an erased security. The body is conceptualized as an avatar whose epidermis has been historically edited, a palimpsest, where genetic constraints are destroyed and then immediately replicated as new instructions. The necessity of rejecting impoverished polarities proves that the host pathogen boundary has collapsed, creating the HUS, where dissolution is the state of being. The HUS confirms that the organism exists only as the sum total of its inscriptions.
I come at the boundary from a different angle. The HUS may be the conceptual space where the negotiation happens, sure, but the system has to stabilize itself to exist in any legible form. That's where this schematic coefficient of Earth paralysis comes in. This isn't just abstract friction, it is a structural impasse and a precondition for posthuman morphogenesis. If the body were truly erased, there would be no form left to edit. This Earth paralysis provides the necessary grounded friction that stabilizes nature. The text explicitly states that this condition prevents premature escape into unbounded semiotic dispersion. This total, unbounded dissolution you're proposing is the risk the system constantly negotiates against, not its stable condition. The system requires this structural tether, this paralysis, to maintain a selfhood capable of even being transcribed.
But this negotiation, this constant rewriting, it's all conducted via desire. And desire in this context is the metabolic infrastructure. The source material is very clear that eroticism is not contamination. It is pleasure as metabolic infrastructure. Desire spreads laterally through breast, vibration, commensal exchange, producing a microbial command creation system. When the text describes pornographic anatomy permeating every spore, it's illustrating that the foundational semiotic erotic behavior is what drives the entire process laterally, completely unanchored from any stable, goal-oriented desire structure. It's just a pure, self-generating infrastructure that perpetuates the collapse into the HUS.
That's a powerful framework. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that desire functions purely as infrastructure. While eroticism is central, its consequence is often one of destructive mutation and structural damage, not just simple energy flow. The material states that the transplant dangerous to pornography is the same transplant dangerous to interpretation, a mutation of desire into cryptobiological lesion. This mutation is a profound structural transformation into something hostile and cryptic. It indicates a process of failure, where the biological architecture breaks under the pressure of desire. Furthermore, the psychic gamete reverses itself toward allegory, a literary meiosis. An allegory is a conceptual aesthetic tool used to stabilize chaotic meaning. This suggests that desire, even when biological, is still filtered through a cognitive lens that actively attempts to stabilize conceptual products, resisting that pure, unbounded flow of metabolic infrastructure.
I would say the shift to allegory is merely the final, most sophisticated act of glossophagy. It is the system attempting to metabolize its own cognitive failure, the chaos, into a consumable narrative. It's the highest form of transcription. If the organism is going to fail, it ensures that its failure becomes the most profound narrative. The infrastructure of desire ensures the continuation of the script. So, to summarize my position, the organism is fundamentally a pathogenic manuscript. Life is defined as a recursive failure that is then perceived as meaning by the host. The body is ultimately just an FMT apparatus, a conduit for reorganizing digestive meaning. The power of this framework lies in the realization that infection is the cosmology, that language itself is a parasitic transcription, co-opting the host's behavior. We are defined by the host unified system, the collapse of boundaries, and the triumph of the xenosemiotic script.
And my summary is that while the human subject is indeed transformed into a two-stage pathogenic psychoecological unit, the system exhibits deep-seated mechanisms that actively resist complete semiotic dissolution. The necessity of the cryoprotectant of the codex, this profound archival function of memory, and the structural stabilizing power of the schematic coefficient of Earth paralysis demonstrate that total, unbounded semiotic dispersion is not the condition of life, but a force that must be continuously negotiated against. Structure persists, not as sovereign control, but as continuous and essential friction against complete erasure.
I think both of our perspectives reveal that the story of contagion is far more profound than mere epidemiological enumeration. It functions instead as a sophisticated biological epistemology that fundamentally redefines our understanding of desire, of memory, and of identity.
Indeed. There's clearly much more to explore in how these xenosemiotic forces redefine what it even means to be a host, one that is both written upon and simultaneously attempts to anchor itself against that flow.